Perfect. Well, I am a woman of her word, and it is exactly 1:02 according to my according to my official Mac calendar here. So I'm going to get us started. So welcome to today's webinar on designing and evaluating summer PD. I'm your host, Carly Norton. I'm also the Director of Marketing at KickUp, which is a company of educators working with school districts nationally to improve instructional practice using educator data. So in the midst of the COVID epidemic, data has become even more critical than ever. And now that we're at the end of the school year, we know the summer is essential to really addressing those educator learning gaps in advance of the likelihood of online instruction in the fall. So today we're hosting a conversation to talk specifically about adapting professional learning plans when content is now being delivered online, designing feedback loops into professional learning to build momentum and improve the programming, and then some lightweight data practices and tools that can help target ongoing support. The way that we're going to spend our time today, this looks overwhelming, but I promise the most important thing on this slide is the fact that we're going to spend the bulk of our time really digging in to a district story, which is Lubbock ISD. But we're also going to set the groundwork with some research about the why of doing ongoing PD evaluation, share a little bit about a framework to get you started if you're thinking about virtual learning, and then provide some tools and tips for gathering post-PD evaluation once you're starting to run your programs. But enough housekeeping. I am really excited to introduce you to my fellow hosts, and I'm gonna ask them to tell us just a little bit about their roles, starting with Jeanette, who has the honor of being just the first on this slide.
Unmute myself before I speak. Thank you very much. I'm Jeanette Simonson-Gorolnik, and I am proud to be working for McREL International. I am a managing consultant, and we support school districts and departments of ed with thinking through, all strategies from, online to in-person instruction and higher, more administrative leadership avenues as well. So very happy to support this, obviously a very needed space and time, and I'll talk a little bit more about our research that we've done in the next couple slides.
Jeanette. And Anna, your turn.
Hi, all right. I'm Anna Jackson, and I'm the Executive Director of Leadership and Professional Development at Lubbock ISD. We are in the panhandle of Texas, where it's pretty warm right now. And we just, in our role, are supporting teacher learning to make sure that they are supporting our students every day. So working with everyone from our principal leaders to our aspiring leaders, our teacher leaders, our classroom teacher leaders, our paraprofessional leaders, and just making sure that everybody is equipped to best meet the needs of the students that we serve in our district. And I'm excited about being here today.
Anna, you must have practiced that answer because it was so perfect. Are you on webinars all day these days?
I do feel like I am quite the Zoom champion these days. It's definitely become an important part of our work.
We've all built some new skills at this end of this year, huh? So I'm going to transition us into really this first topic. And I know whenever we're talking about any skills or strategies, it really helps to ground us in the why. And so to do that, we want to start just by giving a little overview about some key research about data and evaluation. A lot of times when we think about evaluation, it's really this evaluation with a capital E. It feels like high stakes. It's usually tied to things like test scores, and statistical analysis. But one of our favorite researchers around here, Joelle and Killian, really looks at that and coined this term of black box evaluation to really describe this kind of high stakes program evaluation. And typically what happens is, if you look at this visual here, is that we tie our inputs to our outcomes, and student testing data is usually the most common outcome. And that in between remains this like black box. We don't really know what happens in between. And we use whether or not we achieve our results to determine if those inputs worked. And so, one of her arguments is really that feeds into this natural skepticism that we have about the results of professional learning. And so instead she puts forth this idea of a glass box evaluation. And so really it's simple. It's just that what's in the middle matters. And so collecting data along the way about implementation both can give us the confidence that our results are actually tied to the changes that we made, but it also gives us the information we need to make our programs better. And so that kind of view of evaluation is really the core of what we do at KickUp, and what we're going to talk about today is that glass box evaluation. Another way to think about it is really around continuous improvement. And so, you know, right now, continuous improvement is critical to learning and mastering all of these new skills that educators and administrators are taking on with this sudden shift to online learning. In some ways, it feels like we've all put on our Silicon Valley hats and we're trying to do these iterative cycles, but in order to really make those successful, it depends on data. And so if you don't have good data, then you really can't do this kind of continuous improvement cycle. You just can't power it. But we know that all types of data are not created equally. And so this research really personally speaks to me as a data nerd from Carnegie, that just kind of breaks out some of the different types of data people often use towards continuous improvement. The accountability measures are what we typically think of, again, back to that black box evaluation, which are things like testing data, dropout rates. It's really like the end results. And that really matters, but it's not always the most useful for those iterative cycles that we want to use in improvement work. The second piece that I think a lot of times you see people trying to pull into improvement work are research measures. And if you think back to the college stats class that you took, you know, envision those really long, redundant question sets, those surveys that are really designed to ask basically the same question 5 different times to tease out nuances. I mean, that's really useful for researchers. It helps us find the nuances that exist in real life, and it allows people to write great papers and publish research, but it's not always useful or practical to apply within a school setting. And so instead, we're really talking today about practical measures. And these are those kind of lightweight pieces of data that you collect along the way that are tied explicitly back to what you've been working to improve and the measures that you put in place. So with all that said, I wanted to pause just for a minute because, you know, we're all learning about good virtual interaction and launch this poll to ask you, what types of data are you using right now to make decisions about your professional supports? And if you said other, drop it in the chat below, because we know that despite trying to make this poll as comprehensive as possible, we know there are things that are not on this list. So tell us what other things you're using to really make your good decisions about educator support. And I'm going to give about 20 more seconds just to respond to the poll. And perfect. So let's cut the poll, and can we also publish the little elves behind me that are making this thing happen? Can we publish the results? Ooh, I feel powerful. Great. So PD feedback, that's very aligned with what we're going to discuss today, but also some educator self-reflections and coaches, principal, mentors as well. Great. So now that we've really talked about why we evaluate and some of the tools that we might use to gather data to evaluate, let's talk about the framework underneath it. Like what should we be evaluating? I think overnight, even our most decorated classroom veterans began to feel suddenly unprepared. We know really what good instruction looks like in the classroom, but most of us don't know what good instruction looks like online. And so to really kind of fill that gap, in March, we at KickUp started working with McREL to take some existing online frameworks and adapt them to really fit the realities of a crisis. So Jeanette, I won't steal your thunder. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about how we focus these efforts and what we ended up kind of pulling into this framework.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to pull out something from the chat before I begin, which Luke just asked a great question about doing instructional rounds, because obviously this was a practice that we used in the past and will continue to use when we can come back in person. But when we started this focus on a framework, our researchers at McREL really were looking at this online learning and what changes. Obviously, teaching and learning, the foundations for teaching and learning and all the research that is behind it is still there and still effective in an online learning environment. But what changes if we can't do these instructional rounds in person? So this first slide talks a little bit about the work that McREL researchers did to look at the impact, and some of the things that you pulled out in that poll really highlight this technical support piece. Obviously, not everyone was teaching, in a one-to-one environment in their classrooms. And so, absolutely, and as I agree, the student learning piece, which is kind of the next component. But as we look at professional development and as district administrators are trying to decide the impact and what's going to make effective change, we pulled out, you'll see 5 different areas here that really kind of aligned with the evidence and the research that we were doing, from having a tech team to having a self-help support, responsive support right on time so you're not getting frustrated, that teacher training piece that everyone's focusing on this summer, and is it effective in building capacity for teachers and for parents, as you see in the secondary piece of it. Parents are now our at-home support systems, and so, do we build capacity for them from a technical standpoint? But we know not all learning has to happen just online, and so what does that look like in access for all? There's going to be some instructional support that's going to happen, not online. And so the learning systems are still there in terms of content and assignments. And that's where we can fall back on some of the things that we've always done that are really good and the PD that we've delivered. But now we've got this asynchronous and synchronous lesson plan, and it may look different, especially if you're taking surveys from parents and you know that there's a device issue and support from that. So again, some of the tried and true are there for preparing, and so we don't want to throw everything out, but we want to go back to those foundations that are really solid and then build from there in terms of finding out what is our capacity for the next month or however long you have. So you can go to the next slide to kind of address what the next question was asking, which our researchers then took it one more step forward in looking at facilitating the online learning. And what does it look like in practice? And what are some of the measurements that, if you're popping into a Zoom call as an administrator, what are you looking for? How do you set up the learning environment to know that your students are going to be successful, your teachers are going to be successful, but are there any purchases that maybe need to be made as well? And so there's 5 points here that you can look at. Have teachers oriented themselves to the systems that are in place, and getting feedback from them is extremely important. Providing access to all the instructional materials for teachers, but also for parents if they need to know kind of how it fits, and if they can't get on, what are some other supports that we can give them. And that collaboration, communication piece is essential, because we know that that's what good instruction, as we deliver new information, we need to give time to students to collaborate. And then, of course, the assessment and feedback, so we can make different decisions. Our times are changing. We were just before this webinar, we were talking about how, yesterday's information is old because things change. And so being able to look at what stays the same while still looking at that assessment piece and what do we need to change for tomorrow to make it more useful for student outcomes. The student voice has never been so important in this, and teaching them to advocate for themselves. So McREL put together, in support with KickUp, these frameworks, and we'll share a link where you can see a little bit more in depth on how all these work. But then you do need to take it one step further. After we facilitated, how are we seeing that the data points that we want to collect for students are actually being moved? So you can go to the next slide. And this is where McREL, the bread and butter of what McREL stands for is they're a non-for-profit research and professional learning organization. We help educators, school leaders through balanced leadership, through CITW, through lots of different ways. We've now published a book about curiosity and learning that sticks. And so these are really the foundational. Memory hasn't changed. How we hold things into memory, how we maintain curiosity, those are still all there. It's just now the delivery system that we have to look at to make sure that the capacity is there. And so we have a team of expert coaches that can work with schools to help with implementation, because I think that's where we see a lot of the outcomes. We may not, meet the full outcome if we don't do the implementation to the full capacity we're able to. So really utilizing a team. And of course, Anna's going to talk in a minute about how her school system really knocked this out of the ballpark. And so taking those exemplars and seeing if it applies to your current school situations. But certainly if you need thought partners and you need anyone else kind of at the table to think through strategies, McREL International is here to support you, as well as Kick Up with many of the frameworks and the support that they have.
Yeah, and Jeanette, I really like what you said about like the importance of implementation, because I think a lot of times we conflate the idea of using data to ensure that that the implementation is working versus the actual design of the intervention. And those two things are separate. You can have something that's a research proven intervention, but if it's not implemented with fidelity, then it won't end with the same, successful results that you see in a trial.
Yeah, and to that point, and I think Anna will address this as well, but choosing the right tool, the right system, is that the right tool to affect the outcome that you're looking for? And that's why I think all of us being in this together, working with other school districts, working with thought partners like McREL and yourselves at Kick Up, I think we all are in this trying to figure it out. And when we find something that works, finding a place to share that. And so I just appreciate all the work that Kick Up has done to be that organization that helps share best practices and to provide this opportunity for us to have this conversation.
Thanks. Well, as I promised, again, woman of my promise, I want to spend the bulk of our time digging into, how some of that research plays out in practice with a focus on Lubbock ISD. And Anna, it might help if you told us just a little bit about Lubbock, and then specifically how you would frame the problem of practice that you faced over the past couple of months.
Okay, sure. So like I said, Lubbock ISD is up in the panhandle of Texas. We have a little over 27,000 students in our district, a little bit over 1,900 professional staff members that provide support to those students on those campuses. We have 51 campuses. So 5 of those are high schools, 9 are middle schools, and then the rest are elementary schools. So we serve a diverse population. Our socioeconomic, economically disadvantaged student population is a little over 70%. And then we see a wide range of students coming from various backgrounds and cultures and environments. And so we have really been working hard for the last 5 years to go to that implementation question that you were kind of referencing there, Jeanette and Carly, in your comments, that it's not just about what we're learning, but how we're doing with what we're learning. And are we really taking that knowledge and using it to be transformational in the lives of students and in our teaching and learning in the classrooms? And that also makes me go back to the comment about instructional rounds and not just looking at what teachers are saying and doing, but the impact that it's having on what students are saying and learning as well. So we've been working on that for quite some time and felt like by adding in Kick Up, we had taken some really good steps towards being able to measure the implementation of strategies that we were using in our professional development. And then along comes COVID to just kind of turn everything upside down. And so our problem of practice continues to be around implementation, but now it's implementing strategies that we're not even really sure what they are in a time of online learning. And so our shift goes from being as much about implementation to making sure, are we building the right capacity in adult stakeholders right now for them to be doing the right things with students? So we want to continue to be able to measure the learning and the implementation of the professional development, but we also recognize that our professional development may have to shift a little in order to really be able to build the capacity of stakeholders. So that's where we have kind of shifted our focus a little bit in the last few months, just like everyone across, not just, I can't even say across our country, around the world, we've all been impacted by this. So as we thought through kind of where we are and the impact that COVID is having, it has a huge impact on our district leadership. So as we're trying to make sure that we're putting the right supports in place, what evidence are we using to help us make sure we're landing in the right place? Our coaches and principals have been impacted by it in terms of making sure that they know what kind of feedback they should be giving and how do they help support the instructional practices. We've gotten really good at doing that in a physical space. How do you do that in a virtual space? Our teachers, we have been equipping them with great instructional strategies for the physical classroom. So how are we making sure that we're supporting them with the online setting? And then for our students, it was a whole shift of making sure that they had good focus on what the outcomes should be, and were we given the appropriate amount of feedback to them and to their parents to make sure that they were successful in that virtual learning environment. So certainly I think we have seen that COVID has impacted all different levels of our organization, as I'm sure that you are seeing in yours as well. So we began to think about how do we make sure that we're landing in the right spot in collecting evidence to help us measure where we are. So we were thankful for KickUp creating a instrument that we could use to help us with that work. And so as soon as they shared that they had developed a survey, we were like, count Lubbock in, we're in. We are all over that. And so one of the things that we did is we asked our campus administrators to use some of their virtual PLC time to have teachers give us feedback. So one of the things I want you to notice on this slide is we had over 1,400 submissions in the feedback. And one of the things that we have found is that the feedback, just like anything else, the more you have, the richer it is. The more you can count on the fidelity and the accuracy of the feedback that you're getting. So by having our principals set aside a specific time within a window, they had a 1-week window to allow their teachers to do that, we were able to get really good feedback from teachers. And I would just connect that to the larger work that we're doing with KickUp. We have an activity we call content focus sessions, which is one of our primary ways of delivering professional learning in our district. And we use a survey each time we do that to help us really drive the planning of the upcoming sessions. And so we carve out time in the sessions to make sure that they complete the surveys there. And what we've seen is a huge increase in the feedback that we're getting. We are still in a place where we keep our data anonymized by teacher name, just because we want them to know that there's no harm, no foul in giving us accurate data. And we want them to see that when you give us feedback, we are responsive to that feedback. So we have really been working in the last few years to establish a system of trust where you can be very honest and transparent in the feedback that you give. And then we will be very honest and transparent in our responses to that feedback. So we continue to do that as we move forward. Hopefully someday we've created enough of a legacy of trust that we can ask them to be a little bit more forthcoming with that. But right now, the information is more valuable to us than knowing who is giving that information. And so we'll continue to move forward with that. But as we think about some of the learnings that came out of this specific survey that we did, one of the things that I would say is that we realized that in making these huge shifts, one thing we can all agree upon is that this has been a huge leap from everything that we have known in our past. And socially, it's had an impact. Emotionally, it's had an impact on us. And so knowing, are you okay, was a big part of what we needed to know. And as we're thinking about our summer PD and as we're thinking about our fall and what it looks like coming back, that is our first question. Are you okay? We're going to have to ask our parents, are you okay? We're going to have to ask our kids, are you okay? Our teachers. There's so much fear that surrounds what we're dealing with COVID and with other crises that we're facing in our country right now, that knowing where our people are with their social emotional health is very important to us. So one of the things we loved about the Kick Up survey is that it did ask questions about how educators were adapting. And so as we look at that data, another thing I love about Kick Up, if you're not familiar with their surveys and the tools, is that everything connects to a heat map. So you can visually look at survey results and see where your strengths and your weaknesses are. And one of the things that we saw as we looked at our data is that there was a lot of green here, which means that overall people were adjusting pretty well to the new environment. And so we were grateful for that. We could see some dark green areas. So if you look at our CTE group, those people who were already pretty good with technology, they did great with this transition. And so we were able to see that they're doing great. Our instructional coaches and some of our other groups, you can see that overall they were dark green and doing pretty well. But we're also able to see that there's some groups that transitioning their content is a lot harder. Performing arts in a visual or a virtual format is a whole different beast than some of the other work that we're doing. And because they don't spend as much time with online and virtual platforms in their classrooms, making that transition was harder. So how are we going to make sure that we're providing the support to them that they need? We have those others, kind of the outlier groups that we have to make sure that we are providing support to them. So it was helpful for us to see who are some people that we may need to love on a little bit more and make sure that we're providing some support to them as they're transitioning to something that's very different than what is typically a part of the work that they do. Our performing and our visual arts, you can't say enough about the work that they do and the power of what they do, but it's very different to present that content in an online platform. So it was a huge leap of faith for those teachers. And I got to say, they have just worked so hard and they have amazing support in our district to do that work. But the survey data helped us know, let's love on them a little bit more right now. And so that's a valuable piece of having this data. The second thing that we had to think about is how do we shift, now that we kind of know emotionally where people are, how do we shift to the virtual world? How do we make sure that we know what teachers are confident with or not confident with, and what do teachers need support with in their classrooms? We were fortunate that when COVID started coming down the pike, it was the week before spring break for us. And so on the Thursday before we got out, we deployed Chromebooks to every student, second grade and above, which was a huge undertaking. We had already been moving towards a one-to-one platform and had already been doing a lot of training with our teachers, but we had not planned on doing it in mass like we did. Fortunately, we were able to get all of those devices out, and then after spring break, we were able to get them out to our first grade students as well. We also had to work on getting out hotspots for families and parking lots where you could access Wi-Fi, and we had to get a little bit creative with that. But once we made sure that structurally the things were in place, we had to make sure that knowledge of what to do within that structure existed as well. So the next thing that the survey allowed us to do was look at how were teachers feeling about the different platforms in the virtual world, and where were their strengths and where were their weaknesses, and how did we work to make sure that we could support them. So as you look at this chart, you can see this heat map is a little different than the last. You notice some different colors here. And so we still have some platforms that people felt pretty confident with. Google Classroom and Screencastify we've used, so their success rate with that was a little bit higher. But now, in order to make the learning more engaging, they're being asked to use a lot of other platforms as well. So which ones do you feel confident with? Which ones do you need more support around? And how do we make sure that we are equipping you well with that? So this heat map allowed us, we did not expect every person to be an expert with every one of these items. Let me be really clear about that. Sometimes when you're just starting to get things rolling, get good with your hammer, get good with your screwdriver, and then you can add in all the additional tools. So we kind of limited where we wanted them to start. And then as their comfort level increased, they could add in these other things. But we needed to know what things do we need to focus our professional learning on to be able to support them. So one of the things that is kind of interesting about this particular slide is that Screencastify was a tool that they reported some confidence and feeling like things were going really well, but it was also one of the top things that they wanted more support with. So I think that it's valuable the way that these surveys are designed, that it allows you to look at things from multiple angles. So just because I feel pretty good about it doesn't mean I don't think that I can learn more or should learn more with it. And so I really love that KickUp allows us to turn it around from a lot of different facets and look at different facets of how teachers are feeling about the learning and about their needs, and allow us to be responsive. Because without the follow-up question about would you like more support, we would have thought Screencastify was check. Things are great there, but we know that we can continue to improve and have some additional work there. The other thing that I might point out about this chart is that some things are more geared towards elementary, some things are more geared towards secondary. So again, the teacher doesn't have to feel confident in all of them. But where do we need to make sure that we're providing support at the district? And then how do we make sure that our coaches, our district office, our principals are able to help provide support to teachers in the areas that they are wanting additional support in? So that leads us to thinking about our spring and our summer PD. So with spring, we really were looking at virtual PLCs as being the primary format for how we helped teachers get from March to the end of May. So each week, all of our instructional staff was expected to participate in at least one virtual PLC with their content specific team. They had virtual PLCs with their campus as well, where they would touch base each morning. In the beginning, they had to touch base in the morning and the afternoon. And then as we got a little bit better, it went just to the morning. And then as we got a little bit better, it didn't have to be every single day. But in the beginning, it took every second of every virtual PLC that we had. With our virtual PLCs with their curriculum and instruction team, it was the same. In the beginning, it was more than one time a week, but then we were able to go to one time a week, but we still offered Google Hangouts for the ones who might need a little more support. So thinking about implementation, we had to know that there were some people that were hitting the ground and they were running and they were doing great, but there were some people who hit the ground and felt like the ground hit them. And so we had to create some ongoing supports for them as they were building their capacity and their learning. So we were able to do that throughout the remainder of the school year, which led us to our summer PD. And then that was another really big shift for us. In our virtual PLCs, you're in very much a synchronous format where you're getting to engage and have conversations real time via Google or Zoom or different tools that we were using. But as we shifted towards summer professional development, we were going to have more learning that was going to be more of an asynchronous format. So again, on the back side of things, we had to think about, okay, what does that look like? What are the standards of quality for asynchronous learning? How do we make sure that what we're doing is on the right content? How do we make sure that what we're doing, you can't sit in front of Zoom for 8 hours and walk away with a brain cell that's still thriving? So how do we make an adjustment there and make sure that we're still able to deliver the content, but we are doing it in a format that allows it to be best for adult learners and allows us to meet their physical and their social and their emotional needs. So that was a big learning curve for us as well in designing it, because we've never had to really build it that way. And then also as we're implementing it right now and making adjustments and modifications as we go along. So we're really doing a lot of shifting in our learning to recognize that this is an evolution. This isn't a one and done, check, we've got it down, we know how to do this. Every single day we run across a new question or a new problem, or about the time we think we've got it figured out, there's a new twist to it. I was on an earlier webinar and somebody said that the vision of 2020 is very blurred. And I thought, oh, that is so true. You know, nothing is what it seems to be. So we're trying to use summer to continue to equip them, trying to predict what fall is going to look like. And I am not placing any bets on anything at this point because who knows. But trying to make sure that whether we're going to be virtual or face-to-face or blended, that we are equipping teachers with what they need to do to be successful. One piece of the puzzle that we got to think about too is the teaching that we're providing in the last 6 weeks of school versus the content that you're trying to deliver the first 6 weeks of school. It's two very different things. We were fortunate that it was towards the end of school where we could downshift a little bit into more review, but we can't live there. So as we're thinking about new school and having to introduce content in these huge gaps that we're going to have to close, it can't look in the fall like it looked in the spring. So there's a whole new layer of complexity as we prepare for a world where you're having to introduce new content and be able to sustain and support it. So that's kind of where we're living with that summer PD right now.
And we'll pause just for a minute to ask the audience, how are you adapting your professional learning for an online environment? You'll see in the poll that's about to launch that we've pulled just a couple models or trends that we've heard from our district partners, but I really encourage you to add to that other by contributing into the chat. And while people are doing that poll, Anna, I know we also have this visualization that played into planning summer PD as well.
Absolutely. So when we were thinking again about the different components, there are several different pieces of work that have to be done to support teachers and to support students. So one of the huge questions I think that lies around professional development, preparing for online formats, is how in the world do you facilitate collaboration? How do you make sure that you're using tools that allow people to still engage? Because we know that that's so important for the way our minds function. So we had to look at making sure that teachers know how to help facilitate that collaboration long-term and during live sessions and when it's one-on-one and all the different formats. We have to make sure that they've got the support they need with instructional materials. We've shifted. You don't have your textbook, you don't have your handouts. So what are the instructional materials and how do you feel about using them? Assessment and feedback is a huge part of making sure that we're still giving good feedback to students on their performance and adding in a little bit more of a challenge of communicating that well with parents. And then you think about parents, straddling multiple worlds. So I'm still trying to work and I'm trying to teach my child, and I want you to tell me how my child is doing on the parts that I'm teaching my child while I'm juggling work. That's huge and that's very challenging work. So how do we support them with that? And then finally, how do we make sure that we're setting expectations for learning? And again, those last two, that assessment and feedback and those setting expectations for learning, as we transition to to fall, I think that's going to be a slightly different conversation. Because I think we could fall back a little bit on some tools at the end of the school that we won't be able to count on at the beginning when we're introducing new content. So it would be really interesting to look and see how teachers report on that if we're still having to use a lot of virtual formats as we move forward. So using this data, it helps us know that throughout the summer, beyond a shadow of a doubt, we've got to focus on making sure that teachers feel qualified and equipped to facilitate collaboration. We also have to anticipate that as we shift to fall, that it's going to be different than where they were when we asked these questions right at the end of school. So how do we make sure that we are adapting? I guess adapting and fluid are two words that I would use to describe this year. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be very fluid in our responses. We're trying to adapt as it comes, because what we say today and what happens tomorrow may or may not match. So how do we adjust to that and make sure that we're supporting our teachers? But I would just go back to kind of where we started with this conversation. All of this with the learning, the facilitating collaboration, the instructional materials, assessment, setting expectations, that only works when people feel like they're okay. And so taking care of that social emotional component has to be a foundation of everything else that we're doing as we continue to build for this world that none of us could have ever imagined.
Yeah. And Anna, one of the questions that was submitted before we started today from Brittany from Alum Rock Union was like really to that point, like what kinds of strategies can we use to keep teachers engaged with professional learning over the summer when we know it's so critical and that people have a hunger for it, but they're also balancing that probably some burnout from a really stressful year. And I'm curious, I'm sure that you've figured out the answer to that very tough question, but how are you thinking about that?
Well, I can definitely say we have not figured it out, but I will tell you that every day I feel like we're one step closer to figuring it out. I think we have realized that you got to get more now that we survived. We got to get more than just the hammer and the screwdriver into their toolboxes. And so I actually was on a call earlier this morning and we were just brainstorming all of the different ways that you can facilitate collaboration in an online format. Because we got to be plugging in a lot of those opportunities for teachers. It can't just be one tool that we keep using until they're so tired of it that they can't stand it anymore. As I have participated in webinars, and my husband's an educator too, so I've gotten to listen to him sit in on some PD, which is always kind of interesting to be on the other side of it and be the listener. We've got to make sure that we're doing those simple things like brain breaks and body breaks with teachers online, just like we would in the real classroom. So going back to how do we know the adult brain works? How do we make sure that we're chunking things, that we're allowing them to change their brain states by stand up instead of sitting in front of your computer? Simple little things like that. Continually building our resource bank with all the different ways that we can pull people in virtually. One of the reasons that we shifted to more asynchronous during the summer, although I will say that every single one of our PDs also has a synchronous component to at least kick it off. But by shifting to asynchronous, we could go to more self-paced, where you could break it down and work on it at your leisure. We've tried to build lots of choice and voice into it. So if you were to look at some of our virtual PD, you'll see stations still. You'll see choice cards where teachers get to choose some of their learning activities. So we've really had to take some of the things that we know are best practice and just really buff them up and make them shiny and applicable in this different setting. But we can't go, we know, and Jeanette, I think you were kind of saying this even earlier, we know what good quality looks like. We just have to modify it to be able to make it fit in this new learning environment. And so the tools that you've given us with being able to get some feedback from teachers, I think have helped us do that a lot. And I also like what you said earlier, and Jeanette, I think that you were the one that said this as well. We've got to be sharing ideas and strategies, so connecting to others in similar roles in other districts, being part of our learning organizations. I'm part of Learning Forward Texas and Big Learning Forward, and those pieces allow me to connect with other educators across the state and across the nation, and having those abilities to brainstorm with them, that's huge. It's going to take all of us to get through really challenging times, and so how do we pull together to be able to solve some of these really complex problems is big.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it kind of alludes to what's some of the conversations in the chat as well about, including like from Anissa talking about launching a cross-site webinar series so that they could cross-pollinate, because I think what we're seeing is really just this hunger to understand what others are doing, which has a silver lining to a certain extent of opening up, people's minds to different instructional practices as well. So I've heard that in multiple situations where it's kind of like, it's hard to find a good in what's happening right now, but that is it. That's the one piece is this like cross-pollination that's coming that people are really eager to have. And we saw that too in the poll. I think we didn't share the results, but mostly people are incorporating really a mix of those different strategies, which I think also aligns with what you were saying about managing burnout and trying to give people multiple ways to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be remiss if I didn't move us to talk just a little bit about sort of the second half of the title in our webinar, which is really, once we've designed something, how are we monitoring it or evaluating it to make sure that it's successful? And one of the pieces, I know, Anna, you love this slide. We've talked about this slide before, but I know when we think about PD evaluation, a lot of times GUSCI is the thing that we all go to, and we think about these different levels that you can gather to evaluation. And so a lot of times our post-PD feedback is focused primarily on this level 1, participant reactions. Sometimes it can kind of get at participants' learnings, and then a little bit of like organization support and change, and even some emerging self-reflective data about whether or not they plan to apply their skills or feel confident that they can apply these skills. So there are ways to sort of get at these levels, but usually PD evaluation is focused really on that first and second level. And so when we talk about designing a good post-PD form, I'll say I'll steal your phrase from earlier, Anna, like there isn't one fit-all solution. All we know is that there isn't one. But really we think about kind of clumping things in these buckets. So overall experience, was the purpose clear? Was the culture inclusive and welcoming? Content application, do they see a clear path to implement their learnings? Engagement, was the experience engaging? Do they have opportunities to hit those higher levels of learning by applying their learning? Those 3 buckets really help us reflect on how the experience went, like the design of the experience, and that gives us data about how we can reflect and improve upon our professional learning. Whereas these bottom 2 are more tactical, this type of support that people are seeing need for after their professional learning, and even some barriers to implementing learning. So if they perceive that there are barriers that exist, what are those barriers? And so when we're in a normal school year, a lot of our post-PD forms that our partners are using really kind of incorporate these sorts of buckets of questions to really be designed to give you actionable data that you can then take and use and plug into your continuous improvement. And when we think about how this has changed for the online environment, there are a lot of factors that play into post-PD differently. But really, it still kind of comes back to a lot of those same buckets when you're talking about the level 1 reactions. So when we're thinking about experience, now we might have questions that are sort of about tech troubleshooting or errors. There are different things that come into a virtual experience. But we're still asking about experience, and similarly, we're still asking about the types of support that people might need, but it becomes even more important to collect that data because we know that we have to differentiate to meet people at their learning gaps for virtual learning. And so a lot of the what of our questions, or you can imagine sort of the drop-down options are changing and evolving, and the importance of different sections has changed. But a lot of what we're continuing to ask when we're focused on single events is really the same. And so I'll just put one example up here. This is from just a content bank, so you wouldn't have all of these questions on your form. But these are some examples of questions that get to application. And you can see these are really about whether or not people feel confident to apply what they've learned and they see a path forward. And so you can imagine that with an online in an online environment, these questions become even more important because we're dispersing a lot of information to people at very different levels of proficiency with online instruction. And if you are trying to screenshot that, or you would like those questions, we do give them away for free, and I'm putting the link here. I think Luke is already putting that in the chat box as well. So we do have a bank of sample questions, as well as a sample form that we are using now for virtual learning at this link as well. And so to bring it back to Gusky, I think one of the pieces that came up, especially from what you were saying, Anna, is that now with kind of asynchronous learning, this level 2 becomes important and very dispersed of understanding, you know, if teacher A takes course 3, did they or did they not gain the skills and the strategies from course 3 becomes a question that's very unique to course 3. And so typically we're trying to balance gathering this data that's applicable across everyone, so we get those nice heat maps that you were showing before, and we can draw conclusions and see trends. But if we ask these really specific questions about the knowledge from course 3, then we no longer have that beautiful heat map. And so it's really about balancing and embedding the skills and the knowledge questions within the courses, and then kind of triangulating that together with our overview about the experiences. And so you can see here, and I think this is also in the PDF, just sort of a breakdown of, again, looking at those participant reflections versus the participants learning, different kind of sources that you can get to that same information. But we want to pull it all together because it's only together that we get this bigger view of whether or not our PD programs are working. I'm glad that that was the Q&A slide because I honestly pressed the button and wasn't sure what was coming up next. So this is great for my timing, but I know we have some questions that were submitted before we chatted today, and I also would encourage anyone who's on the call right now to drop in questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible, although I know we're coming up on the end. But one question I had for you, Anna, was really just when you're thinking about you know, designing feedback for your PLCs, and I know this is very much a work in progress, but how are you thinking, like, who are you sharing that data with, and what, like, who do you have to share that data with to really make it impactful as a feedback loop?
So one of the groups that we really focus in a lot is who we would kind of call our design team. And so that includes all of our curriculum instruction and our student support services, people, our special services, our digital learning team. So anyone who comes in contact with the planning and the implementation of the work, they're kind of our first line defense. And this was our first year to use KickUp as our survey tool. And so we really wanted to build our capacity to learn it and understand it, give it to our coaches, to allow our coaches to help support it and facilitate the work. And I think in the future, we got to continue to expand that circle so that there's some more direct connection to our campus administrators so that they can see how to build and support that work. So I think for us, it's kind of a rollout of making sure that those closest to the development feel confident and comfortable with it, and then building the capacity in our instructional coaches, and then building the capacity in our campus leaders. And so we're really trying to be intentional about expanding that circle as we continue to build out and allow people to see not only how we design and implement the work, but then how we support and encourage the work as it actually goes back into the classroom or into the virtual classroom.
Yeah. That's great. We may have time for one more question, but I do want to, because we're hitting the end of the hour and I know everybody likes to get ready for their next virtual Zoom meeting. I do want to allude to this webinar that we're having today is really the start of a series of conversations. And so the whole series is really about ensuring effective virtual instruction in time for the fall. And so I hope that those of you who are joining us, that, you know, this is really part one, and the vision here is to sort of paint the picture of why and how we design summer PD. But we know that after we collect that PD data, the next question is how can we implement that to improve our programs. And so part 2, we're so excited about this. As I mentioned before, we love Joelle and we have a little fan club here at Kick Up for her. But she is co-hosting with us a live workshop. And part of that workshop, because we know it's so important to have data and to really practice with your own data, we're going to be pulling in data into it to make it interactive. So if you're able to join us for that, I believe Luke has already posted the registration link to join us for part 2. It's completely free, but we have 4 options for bringing data to that. We will have some sample data that comes from a real district, so you can play around with someone else's data. But if you want to bring your own, you can bring your own existing data as it is. You can use that question bank we posted before, but we actually have taken even kind of a step farther to make it easier for you. We've taken our post PD sample form and put it into KickUp. So if you are interested in using that, it's completely free. You'll have access to that until after the workshop as well. You can just go to kickup.co/monitorpd. We ask for just some information about your schools, your roles, so that you get that nice heat map like Anna has, and it is relevant to your focus as a district. But you can find that at kickup.co/monitorpd, and that's also in the chat. And I think then we have one last poll question for those of you who are hanging loyal in our audience here about what you need to know to best prioritize your supports. And Anna, I'm wondering if you could help kind of just close us out. You, I know, collect a ton of data and look at your work from a lot of different angles. I'm curious, what data have you found to be the most impactful as you're improving your programs?
Oh, wow. That's a really huge question.
I prep you for that question, so I apologize.
Yeah. So, well, I want to go back maybe, and I don't know if this directly answers your question, but I think one of the things that was kind of a big aha for us is going back and thinking about Guskey's work and the levels from participant responses all the way up to student learning outcomes. First of all, I'd say Joelle and Killian totally blew our minds about being able to connect PD to the student learning outcomes, because I think we typically say, well, there's so many things that affect that. It can't be the professional development. And she really pushed us outside of that box to say, well, is it your fault if it's not happening? And we all said, well, yeah. So she said, well, then it's also, you can also take some credit when it does work. And so that was a huge mind changer for us. But one of the big pieces that also stood out as we were looking at our data is participants' reactions in learning is fairly easy to measure. And looking at new knowledge and skills and student learning outcomes is kind of where you're trying to bridge to. But one of the things that we began to recognize is that level 3, that organizational support, if you don't have the support in place, then it doesn't matter how great the PD was in the learning environment, it's not going to transition into a change in experience in the learning experience unless it has that ongoing support. So if I was saying what the data has kind of helped us really have some aha moments around, it's when we're asking people to do things, are we adjusting the organization in a way that supports that change to actually take place? And that was really a big learning piece for us, and something that I think the data allows us to always go back and be asking, well, we asked them to do this really hard thing. Did we create enough instructional coach support to make it happen? Did we create PLC time for them to process? Did we take something off their plate as we were asking them to put something on their plate, which is going to be really big in this time of huge change? We can't just ask them to do everything we've asked them to do in the past and add more without taking something off so that they can manage that change that we're asking them to do. So I think that, I don't know that I answered your question, Carly, but it was something that was definitely turning in my mind as I was thinking about some of the big ahas for us, and that organizational support and change through change is bigger now than it's ever been. And so that's kind of where I would land is how are we evaluating to make sure that what we're asking them to do, we're supporting them to be able to do so that it really does impact teaching and learning.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think you answered my question, but I think you made it more profound. And only someone like you, Anna, would convince me to let it go a minute over our scheduled time. But thank you for closing us out on something So great to really kind of encapsulate this hour together. So knowing that it's now 2:02, I'm going to wrap us up. I know we shared a lot of links today, and there were some questions we didn't get to, so expect to have an email from us soon with both this recording, the slides, and all of the kind of links and resources that we shared today as well. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks especially to Anna and Jeanette for providing so much good content and food for thought for the day.
Thank you.
Have a nice
you.
day, everyone.
Bye.